I think we got a painful situation in this country that right back from 1910 with the union between English and Afrikaner capital, there was a clear resolve that black people in general, Africans in particular, who are the majority across the length and breadth of our economy, who really do hard work, who produce quality production that is competitive, that is sold at an international level and all that. And we got a worker who can work in South Africa. But right back from the Union of 1910, which is why the ANC had to be formed in 1912, there was a very resolute stance that South Africa's economy will grow at the back of super exploitation of black and African labor, and really thoroughgoing super exploitation, what we call colonial wage. The reason why the people of this country right back in 1955 in Kliptown said, when finally there is democracy, government would have to take particular measures. One of those measures would be to ensure that it bans dot system. You know, people used to be paid out of a bottle of a brandy by giving them one tot. Dot system, contract labor, and that when a democratic government is in power, there shall be a national minimum wage where workers will be paid a living wage. I think the recent developments in the Marikana, in Dodorens, and the militant strikes are a demonstration that government have failed to basically ensure that there is a national minimum wage in the country in the best interest of the poor and the working class, who basically few who work in this country take care of the army of the unemployed. I mean, in this country, we've got 26 million people now who basically have no plate of food. 25 of those are black and African. And in our view is that we have been failed by government and the ANC government in terms of addressing this colonial wage. Secondly, there has been a big failure, which is a disaster for the economy as a whole, in that we have a government that has failed to use political power to address the fundamental issue of taking ownership and control of the national wealth of the country. This country is rich, this country has got minerals, but one of the things we know we have failed to do on behalf of both black and white is to take ownership and control of the national wealth by being in control of the strategic commanding heights of the economy, by making sure that our own minerals are basically made available cheap to downstream industries. I mean, we got steel, which in the past, the apartheid regime used ISCO to produce hardcore skills by producing artisans, but at the same time make available that steel cheap into downstream industries to create jobs. Today in this country, steel has been privatized in a company called ArcelorMittal. They are selling that steel to us as a country at import parity pricing. And I'm saying we got minerals that could be used if we had the pragmatic, resolute stance of intervening in the economy. We could have used that steel to basically make that steel available cheap to downstream industries to create jobs. We could, for manufacturing and industrialization, we could ensure that basically we defend the current capability, and also make sure that our minerals, we could impose export tax on those minerals so that those countries who still want to get our minerals, they can get them, but they would get them at a particular level of cost, so that they can decide that instead of just taking them and extract them out of the country, they must set up companies here to beneficiate them, to create jobs. You can take Sasol. Sasol sells to us as a country polymer chemicals that are critical component for plastic industry. In other words, we can build a plastic industry here, and we got ingredients, we got polymers that are sold to South Africa above global prices. But when they sell to China, they sell it cheaper, and meaning that we're losing an opportunity where we could be creating jobs in this country. And our union is not just a union for strike. We're a union that want to defend the current capability. We're a union that is championing that we must diversify and be able to create jobs. A typical example, we got 80% reserves of platinum for globally there in South Africa. But we just being failed. There is a bill now in Parliament. We made submission to say if iron ore and platinum can be sold to us locally at a developmental price, we can be able to create so many jobs. And this we did together with catalytic converter employers. We have got statistics of how many jobs can they create, how many jobs can they basically diversify by using that ingredient. But government still maintain to act in the interest of minerals, energy, and finance complex that is dominant within the minerals sector in South Africa. For sure, there has been a struggle that we fought in this country. And that struggle has been won as a result of the working class being the champions of fundamental change to defeat the apartheid regime. And basically, we defeated the regime using 4 pillars of our struggle: mass mobilization, underground structures of the movement, umkhonto wesizwe, isolation of South Africa on trade, because we convinced the people of the world that indeed apartheid was a crime against humanity. And that's what made the oligarchy, the mining bosses, and there's a guy who wrote on this by the name of John Pilger. John Pilger is a journalist who followed South Africa, and he once made this point that when Mbeki was recalled, it reminded him of the collapse of Johannesburg Stock Exchange in 1985. Because in 1985, everybody would have expected P.W. Botha to come up.
That's the year I was born.
They would have expected P.W. Botha to make reforms that were breaking new ground to reform the apartheid system. But instead, he came up with a speech which was extremely racist, which was intensifying racism. And John Pilger says, look, the bottom line is that the mining oligarchy, De Beers and Capital asked them the question, what are we fearing out of this ANC? Why should we not talk to them? Why should we not engage them and find a negotiated settlement? And he explained to you where those negotiations started in Harare, in Mill Park. The bottom line, he insinuated, and I think he's right, that a deal was done. And that black people in general and Africans as a solution for South Africa, which was a negotiated settlement, was that yes, we will be given political power, but economic power will remain in the hands of the dominant class, which is white monopoly capital and white population in this country. I'm saying this because now those who were involved who were in the Nationalist Party, they've written books to explain what happened into those particular negotiations. And the bottom line, South Africa's economy is basically dominated by minerals, energy, and finance complex. If there's one thing which has now become so evident is how those who are in leadership in the ANC, a bulk majority of them, they directly been co-opted. They own shares, for instance, in the mineral sector of our country. They've got shares. So when we say, look, we should take ownership and control, meaning that we must nationalize our strategic commanding heights of the economy, they could be, as the ANC is the leader of the alliance, they use their succinct position of being in the ANC and in the alliance to make sure that that does not happen. And therefore, in the recent past, we have been witnessing, for instance, in Marikane, you could see that the current deputy president has got direct interest in those firms that had a strike. He had to write emails claiming to be writing them on behalf of the country, when in fact, his interest was directly affected by that particular strike. So like anybody else who owns shares, he wanted that strike to be over as yesterday, hence he exchanged emails. Recently, we had the minister who was busy facilitating the solution in that strike. Later on, it has publicly been reported widely that, in fact, the minister owns shares in the platinum belt. We have come to terms with our reality, which is why Numsa Special National Congress has become a big issue. in the country across the political landscape. We have tried to think that we can try and influence things from within, but quite frankly, you're dealing with the leadership of the ANC that is completely compromised, that is conflicted, that is not simply, the issues we're raising, a fight for manufacturing and industrialization, a fight to defend the current capability to diversify the economy, to industrialize, with very simple measures we said needed to be done. If we would have convinced the world that apartheid was a crime against humanity, why should we fail to convince the world that we, as South Africa today, having in 20 years of democracy, having done everything else that we were told by rating agencies, everything else, there's no revolutionary program in these 20 years which was about fundamental change that was implemented. We implemented GEAR, which basically destroyed jobs in this country because it reduced tariffs and allowed dumping of production from other countries to destroy our own sectors. We, at the advice of the same rating agencies, we have liberalized trade, we have removed exchange controls, allowing money that we need to be invested in productive sectors of the economy to create jobs here. But we allow money to leave into financial speculation in Melbourne and to London. The money that leaves this country through capital flights is frightening. As we speak, we've got a huge trade deficit. Our indebtedness as a country, in 1995 we were around 25 billion. Today we're talking about 132 levels of indebtedness. In other words, the country has become one of the riskiest places to invest in. And we know what needs to happen. All what we need to do is to increase tariffs and convince the world that, especially in the light of the failure of these rating agencies' policies, which are Washington consensus policies that have collapsed globally, that we need to increase tariffs, we need to ensure that we bring back capital controls. Thirdly, instead of the Reserve Bank to act only in the interest of finance capital, because what I'm raising to you is that one thing we have seen, there is privileging of finance capital over industrial capital in this country. And that need to change if we were to deal with poverty, unemployment, and inequalities. Because finance capital, as you know, it penetrates every aspect of our lives, it penetrates every corner of the globe. They decide what they want to be done where. If they don't want us to beneficiate our own minerals here, and they want to we must remain a site for extraction, and that our minerals must benefit other people, and that's where they maximize more profit. That's how they influence the direction of the country and the world, using Davos, World Bank, and all global platforms that they are hegemonic around. So this is a struggle. This is about class interests. This is about who stand to benefit. And I'm saying we have tried to think that we could convince the current leadership. What I'm talking about is not even a radical program. It's just a nationalist program that every nation which is voted, that is got democracy, those who are in leadership, they must do everything in the best interest of their own country. And yes, various countries must have interest in your minerals and so forth. They must enjoy those minerals, but you must be able to explain what first is in your interest, under which condition they must be able to get those particular interests. In other words, we're not advocating that we should have a situation where those who benefit out of our minerals must stop to benefit. But those minerals must benefit us first. They must be beneficiated here. They must create jobs here. It can't be that we are just a site of an army of the unemployed whose mission is to be paid absolutely nothing, starvation wages. Our role is just to extract minerals. We must work for the jobs that basically nobody can live at the level of. If you would look at the Gini efficiency today, it's terrible. It's worse than apartheid when it was. It dropped it to, I think it's 0.6 now, from 0.7. And I mean, it's bad. Inequality have worsened in this country. We are the only country where the gap between ordinary workers and their employers is 1,728 times. Who can live under those particular conditions? And this is the basis under which, as a union, we took a view that we can't continue to reproduce the very same miseries, both even as we understand what need to happen. We think now it is the time for the working class to organize itself as a class for itself. Hence, we are going to launch the United Front to challenge this neoliberal discourse that is ravaging our communities. I mean, right from the shop floor to communities, there is service delivery protest because there is no plate of food. You would appreciate in this country, we used to have homelands, which were as a result of the Land Act of 1913, which basically proletarized the people of this country, kicked them out of their land, it took their stock and threw them in unproductive land, in poverty, to do what? So that they must go back as real proletariat to look for work, to survive, and to serve this white, male, racist, dominated economy, which has not changed. All what we simply did was to replace a white administration with a black administration, and apartheid continues by other means because it is still black people who are languishing in poverty, in unemployment, and inequalities. It is the life of white people that continues to be a better life. We get promised every 5 years for a better life, but on a consistent basis. Poverty, unemployment, inequalities is ravaging black people, Africans in particular. You can go to school, which is a key to liberate society. It is about 11% of the school that produce 90% of good quality result. The rest comes from the township, and township schools are still township schools because it's very easy. Those results are not going to change because the black community brings poverty through the school, helplessness, no confidence. But those who access the economy, who own the economy, they bring wealth into their schools, they bring confidence. Which is why we're saying to address the issue of ownership and control is equally an important issue of addressing equal access to the economy by both black and white. The solutions are not in any room, they are actually in the actual theater of struggle. What you just illustrated was the question of how the capacity of the state have basically been eroded, destroyed during this 20-year period. I mean, we used to have a state that used to intervene in the economy, which used to employ workers, that used to pay them wages. And so whether it's a living wage, we can debate that. But there was capacity in the state where workers will build roads. And this was the Nationalist Party regime. The workers will build roads. They had skills to build those roads, and it was quality roads. And there will be Algoa Regional Services, where I used to stay in the Eastern Cape. These workers had capacity to build access rural roads, which are gravel roads. They will know how to maintain them, and they will build tar roads. That capacity was there. They will move, they were paid, there were jobs. And this was during the apartheid era. One of the things that we had to fought against in 2002 with this right-wing neoliberal agenda was a belief that the state has no business in business. We were told you must allow the markets to basically continue to drive and to champion. The role of the state has been under attack. We fought for years to say you can't erode. And what did we do? We destroyed that. And yes, tendering system replaced the role of the state. And we know the corruption that goes with it. Individuals who are connected will get those tenders to powers that be. But what are we ripping? We're ripping terrible roads. We're ripping potholes. There's no quality roads. And there's no jobs that get created. And I think there are a few things to be said. I think there's no replacement for a state that intervenes in the economy in the best interest of its own people. In other words, there must be a nationalist program, a nationalist agenda for the country, which everybody must be able to support. And therefore, there's no replacement for strengthening the state that decisively intervene in the economy in the best interest of the people. Secondly, look, for where we're sitting, we're a manufacturing union. We think that if you are to deal with poverty, unemployment, and inequalities, which is why the rest of other developing countries and developing nations have done, has been to just take one simple decision that says manufacturing matters. And we will do everything else to defend and to grow our manufacturing capability. And you can't do that if you don't take ownership and control of your strategic minerals, and meaning that you would have to nationalize those commanding heights of the economy. And once you nationalize and you know this is done for manufacturing and industrialization, and in our view, that nationalization must be under worker control, because workers will defend and make sure that there's no cronyism where individuals use the state for their own selfish accumulation, because workers have got a direct interest both to defend their jobs and to create jobs for their own children, who must be the future of the country, who must be the workers of the future economy that we should be building. This is what China is doing. This is what Koreans are doing. They rely on their own strategic minerals to be able to defend their manufacturing, to champion industrialization. But thirdly, I think that what the country need a very solid stance about this question of ownership and control of the economy in the best interest of both black and white. Because that's the only way you can change power relations in South Africa. In South Africa, we are in 20 years in democracy, but racism is still order of the day, because we have failed to ensure that both black and white can have equal access to the economy. And that needs bold leadership. It can't be leadership. One lip of the mouth is about grappling with this question. The other lip is about the interest of what that leader has been co-opted because he's already benefiting. Because when you must do this fundamental transformation, you are going to ruffle feathers. You're going to have, there is those who are benefiting as white monopoly capital in the minerals, the way they are basically extracting our minerals. They don't want that to be tampered with. In my view, that need to be tampered with, and not to stop them to continue to extract and to benefit. We should be able to say, from those minerals, a particular chunk of those minerals will be utilized to build South Africa's economy, to champion manufacturing by making those minerals, because they are our own national endowment, cheap, available to downstream industries, to create jobs, to diversify, to build new industries, because that's the only way. It's about growing the economy that you can be able to create jobs. It's about paying workers a proper living wage that you can be talking about economic growth, because people have got buying power. The fact that we got a right to speak is a step in the right direction. The fact that we're able to express ourselves without fear or favor explain that we are in a democratic dispensation. But I think the danger with the democratic dispensations we have, today there's no longer buses for whites, buses for blacks. There's no longer toilets for whites, toilets for blacks. You can buy a house of your own choice in a suburb of your own choice. You can take your children in South Africa to a school of your own choice. But one thing we have learned in this past 20 years is that access to those rights is determined by your economic position in society. In other words, those rights are bourgeois rights. If you don't live a middle-class life, if you don't own the economy, if you have no link and you are alienated, as the majority of the people of this country are in the economy of this country, you will be permanently condemned to perpetual poverty, unemployment, and inequalities. And I think the Freedom Charter was very clear, not just the Freedom Charter. You can go back in 1969, the liberation movement led by the ANC, in its conference in Morogoro, this became ANC strategy and tactics that they are not reading. I'm not even talking about the Freedom Charter. It says that basically that conference visualized a future South Africa. And it said, we don't underestimate the enormity of future challenges that the ANC government, when it is in power, would be confronted with. However, that government would have to ensure that the basic wealth of the country is restored back to the ownership of the people as a whole, not to be manipulated by sections, be they white or black. The Freedom Charter went further to say mineral wealth beneath the soil, banks and monopoly industries shall be transferred to the ownership of the people, to basically do what I'm talking about, of making sure that those are being utilized, those commanding heights, for defending manufacturing capacity, for growing the economy, to ensure equal access to both black and white. That's the only way you can be able to change power relations in society. Well, one of the things that the Freedom Charter said is that there's no government in a democracy that can just claim authority unless it is based on the will of the people. I honestly think that unless this is a struggle, there is a fundamental contradiction in society between labor and capital. In our view, that contradiction cannot be resolved by anything else. It requires a revolution. In other words, there is no class that is busy accumulating in all fronts, in our minerals and so forth, that will volunteer out of that accumulation for free. And therefore, between the working class and the capitalist class will continue to seek to win hegemony for its own accumulation. I think as the organized working class, we should be able to rely from our own honest, advanced detachment of the working class, which must be a product of the exploitation of the working class. We must be able to hate exploitation. We must seek to destroy it. We must be able to want to win the war against greed in order to advance a society that advances humanity. Unfortunately, that is a class war. Unfortunately, that is class struggle. And when we speak openly, honestly, there is a majority of the people who applaud, who support what we do, but at the same time, we do multiply enemies. There are people who want to choose friends for us, and we're very firm that their enemies are not our enemies. Our friends are our friends. And therefore, the working class must organize itself as a class for itself if it must break new ground, if it must defend what we have secured, which is democracy, and to build on that. We must win, for instance, the youth on our side. I mean, basically, to win this war is to ensure that the working class exits and the youth exits come together, because that's the future. The young people of today who were not there when apartheid was brutalizing, they would be in a state of confusion, because capital is also not standing still. It uses education. There's no neutral education. In any society, the dominant class in society uses education to reproduce itself. It defines development out of its own image, which is why the working class must not just win the youth, it must win the intelligentsia on its side, it must win the academia, and it must be able to win that hegemony by even convincing capital that, listen, it's either is going to be blow by blow fight with yourselves, or you must accept that you can still make money because we're in a capitalist mode of production. But the bottom line is that you can't continue to think that in a sea of poverty, unemployment, and inequality, that you think that that is sustainable. Because basically, with the level of wealth, and where basically few individuals are swimming in wealth, whilst the majority is dying of hunger and starvation, this is basically not sustainable. This is not going to be good for any investment. People are saying, look, you're going on strike, you're going to chase investment, as if investment are people who stay in heaven. Investors are people who would have exploited workers somewhere else, and the decision to go and invest is informed about where can we go and invest money and where most can we be able to generate returns. And as Numsa, we are soldiering in many fronts. I mean, our battle is all-sidedness. It's not one single battle in a single front. We're fighting for growing the economy, to champion manufacturing and industrialization. But at the same time, we're saying where the bosses are maximizing profit, there must be economic redistribution of the social surplus that the working class produce. The failure to do so is only greed that wins the day, and black people in general, Africans in particular, the majority of the people of this country, including whites, you would have a situation where basically there's nothing good for us. The black and Africans are in perpetual poverty. Whites are swimming in wealth, which they have no place to enjoy it because of the rate of crime, the rate of violence, and everything else that is associated with social ills, where basically exploitation and greed becomes the order of the day. And while this is a struggle we must wage side by side with the youth, as I'm saying, it must be our attitude of mind and our way of life. If the future is set, it must be certain. Well, we have taken very groundbreaking resolutions that could lead to Numsa being dismissed in COSATU, but not just that. I think over the couple of months, personally and the collective of Numsa as individual and as a collective, there has been everything else that has been done to seek to isolate, to target us with propaganda, with the sole purpose to liquidate our persona, because we happen to be privileged to lead these workers that we are privileged to lead, and to be honest, in championing what we think is right and what we think is wrong. And one of the things we said, for instance, about the alliance, we said this alliance is an alliance that was basically developed in trenches of struggle, where there were no people who were co-opted working with the regime, with capital. Remember, apartheid was sustained for more than 300 years. The reason why it took so long to defeat it is because capital accumulated out of apartheid, because there were no rules, there was no labor law, there was super exploitation where workers had absolutely no right. Black people, by virtue of their color, they had no right whatsoever. And therefore, that was a perfect environment for capital to champion its own greed. And I'm saying, when we're in the trenches where the alliance was born, there were no people who were motive force who stood to benefit in the very same accumulation of a class that exploit the bulk majority of the people in this country. Today, as I say, you got people who are in business during the day, who are with us in meetings during the day. At night, they are busy shaping the deals together with the class that exploit the working class to keep the status quo of the working class and the poor. But not only that, I mean, the levels of poverty, the statistics are frightening. Inequality in this country has worsened. The truth of the matter is that this is completely not sustainable. But when you say, look, let's take measures within the alliance, then you will have the ANC adopting the National Development Plan, whose mission is to conceal the failure of right-wing neoliberal policies that have been implemented for the past 20 years. Secondly, it says nothing. It doesn't talk about jobs and job creation and champion manufacturing. In fact, what it talked about, the nature of jobs, is office window cleaning and hairdressers, jobs that will be generated by the NDP, and it keep the dominance of white monopoly capital intact. There is no agenda to industrialize, to champion manufacturing, and to address issues of ownership. But it's a perfect strategy to conceal the Washington consensus that has been globally discredited, that is responsible for the global crisis of capitalism today. And that's the challenge. And we said, look, this alliance doesn't work. It's only used every after 5 years for purposes of election. And we got a mandate to convince COSATU to break with the alliance. That's a Numsa Special Congress resolution. From where Numsa stand, we said we shall form a united front that must be on the street, mobilizing the working class, the youth, to challenge the neoliberal discourse, but also to keep government accountable, make sure that those who are in public office, they account properly, and stop the anarchy that we've seen, whether you talk about Nkandla, whether you talk about government ministers trying to pull a wool in the eyes of the nation, lying. I mean, for the first time, we heard people saying that a swimming pool is a fire pool. And I mean, we have been challenged, but also to make sure that all strategic institutions are basically being used to create jobs. You stop looting that we think is taking place in various strategic institutions. But we said it's time for the working class to form a movement for socialism that will speak in the interest of the country, to champion manufacturing, because the working class and the youth must be able to have jobs. But at a particular point, that movement for socialism must be able to contest the election in the best interest of the people of this country.